The veracity and trustworthiness of Christianity depends solely and completely on the truth of or falsehood of a historical event, namely the resurrection of Christ. So says Richard Simmons III, who was an author on the historical basis for the Christian faith. In other words, it's like he was saying, if the resurrection did not happen, then Christianity is a dead religion of no real importance. On the other hand, if the resurrection did happen, then the Christian faith is of infinite importance. And everything else pales into insignificance. But C.S. Lewis said it better. Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. We're here this morning to celebrate our faith in this historical event that happened almost 2,000 years ago on a Sunday morning, so early in the morning that it was still dark when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, where she had seen the dead and shrouded body of Jesus laid on the cold stone inside the hollowed rock just 2 days before. She had seen him there. She had seen him laid there, quiet and still, held silent by the power of death. Now, she no doubt had seen dead people before, perhaps many times. It was not hard to witness death in that culture or in that environment. You see, the culture of first century Palestine was not nearly as insulated as ours when it comes to death. We try to sanitize it, removing it from our immediate experience and giving that responsibility of caring for the body to professionals like undertakers who make the body look as presentable as possible to us. And we even say things like, "She looks good, doesn't she?" All of this is our way of keeping death a little bit at an arm's length. Her culture didn't do that. She was going to be responsible for anointing the body with spices and ointments. Mary knew what a dead body looked like. She and the other women were fully prepared to anoint Jesus' body for burial. They seemed to know exactly what spices to use. This wasn't their first rodeo, so to speak. I'll come back to Mary just a little bit later, though. It is this idea of the resurrection of Jesus, that much of the world is just unconvinced about. Remember, if it's true, then there is nothing comparable in importance. And even a non-believer, an atheist, would tell you this, that if they knew that the resurrection was true, that it happened, that it would be the most important event in all of human history. But they hide behind the veil in considering it to be impossible, to be mythical, to be just a fantasy created by some disillusioned followers. If it's true, it's the most singular event in all of history and all of time. It is the singular event by which all history and all time is going to be judged and understood by. It can't be just an event among several important events. You can't list 10 top events and have the resurrection as being one of them. Absolutely not. If it's true, it is the event. It is the event. making that day like no other in history. Now, it's right here that I think we as Seventh-day Adventists make a mistake. Because I was born and I was raised in this faith, a fourth-generation Adventist, and I have had a little bit of experience growing up in the church, as many of you have as well. I've always felt, and as I think back on it, I say to myself, the resurrection just wasn't really emphasized. It was talked about, but it wasn't emphasized like the event. I mean, we didn't usually have like Easter celebrations and so forth and onward like that. We had other kinds of things we focused on. And it led me to the conclusion that I don't think we have put the resurrection of Christ in its proper place of importance. And I've thought about why that might be. Perhaps we're concerned that if we emphasize the resurrection, which occurred on a Sunday morning, by the way, we just might be playing into the hands of other Christian folds that think of that day in such a way that they've decided that it is a sacred day. If there's anything that Seventh-day Adventists are concerned about, is considering Sunday as sacred. And so maybe that is what has held us back. But if that's true, we've not gained, we've lost. It's as if we've allowed the rest of Christianity, so to speak, to kind of rob us a little bit of the meaning and the significance and the power of what happened on that Sunday morning. We don't need to be afraid. Nowhere in Scripture does it tell us that we're to actually start worshiping on Sunday simply because Jesus was resurrected on that day. But that doesn't mean that the resurrection is somewhat secondary as an article of our faith. I will say it again. It is the article of our faith. It is what we stake our very life and destiny and eternity on, is it not? If it happened, we have every reason to do that. If it didn't happen, we're of all men most miserable. Many have endeavored to prove that the resurrection is nothing more than a myth, thought up, as I said earlier, by some disillusioned fishermen to save face after being bitterly disappointed. Frank Morison was a very gifted English lawyer. He set out to write a book that was going to be titled Disproving the Resurrection of Jesus. That was what he was going to call his book. He was convinced that he could prove what his title proclaimed. However, when he completed his research, he wrote a completely different book, now a classic, titled Who Moved the Stone? Morison demonstrated that the rules of evidence in a court of law, to his satisfaction, confirmed Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Here are the opening words from his book. This study, in some ways, so unusual and provocative that the writer thinks it desirable to state here very briefly how the book came to take its present form. In one sense, it could have taken no other, for it is essentially a confession, the inner story of a man who originally set out to write one kind of book and found himself compelled by the sheer force of circumstances to write quite another. It is not that the facts themselves were altered, for they are recorded imperishably in the monument and in the pages of human history. But the interpretation to be put upon the facts underwent a change. Somehow the perspective shifted, not suddenly as in a flash of light or of inspiration or insight, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, by the very stubbornness of the facts themselves. So here we have a skeptic, an agnostic at best, certainly not a Christian, who was driven by the need to write a book which would, in his mind, disprove the fact that the resurrection ever happened and therefore put to rest all the ridiculousness of this Christian faith. And they're talking about worshiping a living Savior and all of that. So he rolled up his sleeves and he set to work on this. Now, he was a lawyer. He was used to looking at evidence and weighing evidence. And so as he proceeded to look at all the evidence that was out there, for or against, he came to the conclusion that he was wrong. Indeed, Jesus had been risen from the dead. And he was persuaded by the stubbornness of the facts. What were those stubborn facts that he couldn't get around? Well, I've listed just a few of them here this morning that I want to kind of go over briefly. First fact that he had to wrestle with and accept was that Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure and that he died by crucifixion dealt by the Romans. There are over 39 ancient sources, many of which were written by non-Christians. 39 ancient sources which document that there was a figure in first century Palestine named Jesus who was from Nazareth and who had followers. Friends, that is a historical fact. That is a historical fact attested to by ancient historians, non-believers and believers alike. Now, by contrast, there's only 9 ancient documents referring to Tiberius Caesar. How many of you believe Tiberius Caesar existed? Yeah. And there are 39 which document Jesus. Furthermore, many of these documents make it clear that this Jesus was put to death by crucifixion at the hands of Roman authorities. So we know we're dealing with a historical fact here. The second fact that Morrison looked at was one that probably wouldn't have occurred to me, but it did to him. That this Jesus, who was crucified, was probably buried in a private tomb. They've never been able to locate exactly the tomb. There's lots of theories, there's possible locations, but none of it has been able to be arrived at with certainty. Surely, the early followers, if they knew where that tomb was exactly, they would have marked it in some way, right? Another fact, soon afterwards, after the crucifixion, the disciples, his followers, exhibited discouragement, bereavement, and despondency, having lost hope. They didn't immediately go out starting to concoct this story about the fact that Jesus was arrived. But probably the most important fact that is just absolutely stubborn is the fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his internment. The empty tomb is a problem for those that claim that Jesus wasn't resurrected. Where's the body? All agree that there was a missing body. And if Jesus did rise from the dead, then if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, one could only conclude that someone had to have stolen the body. It had to have been moved. That seems quite logical, doesn't it? If Jesus did not rise, where's the body? It didn't just disappear. Someone had to take it and move it to another location. And if it was stolen, all scholars agree you have basically 3 groups of people who would probably be motivated to steal it. The Romans, the Jewish authorities, or his own disciples. You can kind of rule out the Romans and the Jewish authorities pretty quickly. They're not really the best suspects because they really had nothing to gain and everything to lose if indeed they stole it. For if they had, all they would have had to do to put this whole resurrection ridiculousness to an end would be to produce the body. Why didn't they? If they moved the body, why didn't they produce it? It would have been the death knell for the resurrection story. But they didn't, because they didn't steal it. It was the famous British historian Arnold Toynbee, who was an unbeliever, by the way, who said, quote, "If only they could have found the body of that Jew, then Christianity would crumble into ruins." So, you're left then with the disciples. Could they have stolen the body, disposed of it, and then have spent the rest of their lives propagating a lie, particularly when the heart of their teaching was to be committed to proclaiming this truth? Does anyone seriously believe that these men who were discouraged, defeated, and who feared for their lives would go out, steal Jesus' body within 2 days, and then proceed to boldly preach the resurrection to hostile crowds? Think about it. What would motivate them to do this? Why face prison, torture, and death, all the while knowing that Jesus' dead body lay in some hidden place that they had placed it? That stretches credulity, doesn't it? Why would they do that? What could they have gained from it? They gained a lot of suffering, let me tell you that. No. They didn't steal the body. Something else happened to it. We move to the next fact, stubborn. The disciples had experiences that they believed were actual experiences of the risen Christ. Have you ever thought about the fact that our faith, that is your faith, my faith, it rests on eyewitness accounts? It rests on people who say they were there, they saw it, they experienced it. Accounts of people who saw and touched the risen Christ. In a court of law, eyewitness testimony is taken very seriously, especially if it's more than one eyewitness, right? That accumulates power in terms of evidence. But on the other hand, hearsay evidence is not given near as much credence and oftentimes just thrown out of court. Objection, hearsay. You weren't there. You didn't really see it. And then the final stubborn fact is that due to these eyewitness experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly, radically transformed. Transformed to the point where they were even willing to die for their belief. There are more facts, but time doesn't allow me to go into all of them. These that I have chosen form, I think, the heart of the argument. To any unprejudiced observer of these facts, the most plausible explanation is that the event occurred just as it is recorded. Jesus is alive. He rose from the dead. At this point, when you reach this point in your spiritual journey, in your spiritual quest, you're confronted. You no longer can play at this. You must step out in faith or not. You know, there comes a moment when the children who have been playing hide and seek hush suddenly and ask themselves, was that a real footstep in the hall? the game suddenly loses its innocence. It loses its fun. Things become serious. There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, which is really nothing more than man's search for God, suddenly draw back, supposing we really found him. Was that a real footstep in the hall? We never meant it to come to that. Worse still, supposing he found us. Again, I want to state it clearly. If the resurrection of Jesus really happened, and I believe it did, it is the singular most important event in all of Earth's history. It changes literally everything. Our lives today depend on what happened that Sunday morning. Now let's return to Mary. Her response at seeing the tomb, which only about 40 hours earlier had housed the body of Jesus, to which she was an eyewitness, her response to that was not joy, but something that bordered on despair. She certainly did not believe that her Lord had been resurrected. She instead asked not once, but twice, where his body had been moved to. It could have been moved by those who intended harm or by somebody else, but she knew it had been moved by somebody. They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him, she said. The two angels that were there and the gardener, in her mind, both then asked her the same question. Why are you crying? Why are you weeping? You see, it was not Mary's eyes that were opened first. It was her ears. Why are you crying? They've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. Not her eyes, but her ears, because Jesus said to her, Mary. Don't you wish you could have heard? If there was one thing that I could go back and want to be an eyewitness to and actually hear, I would have wanted to hear what Jesus sounded like when he said her name. Mary. What was his tone of voice, do you think? How did it sound? The one thing that we know, to Mary, it sounded familiar. She didn't have to ask any questions after that. She had heard that sound, that voice calling her name many times before. Mary. In that one word, her name, her life was forever changed. Mary. Today, as we struggle to make sense of life and our role in it, as we are frantically looking around to find out what's true, what we can really count on, is there anything out there that will never let us down? If we're not too self-obsessed and consumed by our own suffering and grief, we perhaps can still hear the question, why are you weeping? Why are you crying? That's heaven's question to us today. Why are you crying? Well, I'm crying because life is meaningless. I'm crying because there's no hope. I'm crying because I just can't take any more of this. I'm crying because life has no purpose. I'm crying because suffering and evil and darkness have depths that I I cannot deal with. Tears are our character's rainfall, we say. Oftentimes they are what make our characters grow. But not the kind of tears that Mary was crying that morning. Not those kind of tears. Her tears were born of despair, of hopelessness. It were the tears of those who grieve that have no hope. And to these kinds of tears, Jesus asked the question, why are you weeping? Why are you weeping, Mary? Long before this, the prophet Isaiah set the stage for this Sunday morning when he asked the question in a little bit different words, but nonetheless it was the same question back in Isaiah chapter 40, beginning with verse 27, where we read, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my cause is disregarded by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. Why are you weeping? Why are you crying? Mary, do you not know? Have you not heard? Do you not know what happened this morning? Death lies wrapped up in the burial shrouds inside of that tomb," he said. "It couldn't hold me, and because it couldn't hold me, someday it won't be able to hold you either." The one unalterable fact that stares us in our face all of our waking days, that day of reckoning that we call death. With all of its finality, with all of its horrible indifference to our fears about it, Jesus said, I left that in the tomb. It's been defeated. And it's been stripped of its power. I grabbed it by the throat and I squeezed the very life out of death. I did it for you, Mary. As a matter of fact, I did it for all the Marys of the world, for all the Susans of the world, for all the Thomases of the world, all the Jameses of the world, all the Bruces of the world, all the Beths of the world. I did it for whosoever of the world. So I ask you again, why are you weeping? And that's not all. The resurrection power, it's not just for the future. It's not just for the end. I will give it to you today, he said to Mary. I'll grab that person who is dead in sin, and I will squeeze the life out of that death, and I will give you a new birth, a new life, a resurrection life. Because of this Sunday morning, Jesus said, your tears can change. You can now cry a different way and for a different reason. And someday you won't need to cry at all. Because of this Sunday morning, you can be a new creature. Because of this Sunday morning, nothing can destroy you. The forces of evil can't defeat you. They have to let go of their dominion over you. I have died to death for you. You can die to death in me. Because of this Sunday morning, you can see eternity on the horizon. As a matter of fact, you can begin to taste it now. Because of this Sunday morning, you will never walk alone in life, Mary. When George Bush was vice president under the administration of President Ronald Reagan, he was chosen to represent the United States at the funeral of former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Any of you remember Brezhnev? Bush gives the account that as he was there representing the United States, he was deeply moved by a silent protest carried out by Brezhnev's widow. She stood motionless, he said, by the coffin, until just seconds before it was to be closed forever. Just as the soldiers touched the lid, he said, Brezhnev's wife performed an act of great courage and hope. A gesture, he said, that must surely rank as one of the most profound acts of civil disobedience ever committed. She reached down before the coffin was closed, and she made the sign of the cross on her husband's chest. There, in the citadel, the very citadel of secular, resurrection-denying, atheistic power, the wife of the man who had run it all hoped that her husband had been wrong. She hoped that there was another life, and that life was best represented by Jesus, who died on the cross and was resurrected from the tomb, and that same Jesus might yet have mercy upon her husband. In the halls of the most godless philosophy on earth, a small seed of resurrection hope was still alive. This hope, this belief, it's hard to extinguish once you understand it. And that is the key, of course, once you understand it. Once you understand it and place all of your faith in it, you will begin to sense the calling to proclaim it to others and to ask the question that the world, though it does not know it, is dying to hear the answer to. Why are you weeping?